Hello, class. This is my first attempt. Well, like my second attempt, my first attempt with you guys. Doing the video thing, so we'll see how it goes. Um, Difficult, especially for a discussion type thing, but some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today lays the groundwork for the discussions to follow, and probably be easier to talk about than to type out. So, we're moving towards the concept of personhood. And what exactly does it mean to be a person, which with regards to ethics seems to have great importance. For biomedical ethics, who counts as a person, who doesn't? Do we begin as persons and then lose that personhood for some reason? Whether that be, lack of brain activity or because we've committed a heinous crime? Are we not a person until a certain point in time, whether it's our heart begins to beat or we become conscious or what have you? But it also has to do with things like animal rights as well. What things do we eat, what things do we not eat, and why? So, what I've got here on the board, I don't expect you to be able to read this. This is my own notes to keep myself sort of on track today, because this could go off in lots of different directions. What I wanted to do was kind of give an overview of some of the more prominent ideas behind what it is that makes a person, and the tie to ethics. And this is a theme that's sort of been running throughout the course, right? We saw when we turned toward Plato, for instance, right? That what we are is we're selfish, right? We want to try to get away with as much as we can without getting caught. Then Nietzsche kind of builds on that with the nihilism stuff. We want to be exceptions. We should try to be exceptions if we're winners. That's how we succeed, right? So success is part of personhood, right? But Nietzsche, of course, also wants to tie it back to the animalistic drives, like we talked about. So part of the human condition is we're also still animals too. Then when we started looking at the actual ethical theories themselves, Aristotle wanted to highlight the fact that we're reasonable, that we're rational, that we are not merely animals. We have this third part of the soul that plants and animals don't have. Yes, we grow. Yes, we have the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, but we also can think abstractly. And Aristotle also wants to highlight the fact that we're social animals. So that's part of personhood, this community aspect. Mill also wants to play upon the community aspect, this working togetherness, but he wants to shift the focus a little more towards our functional capacities, towards the things that we can do instead of necessarily who we are. Our utility or our usefulness is a major aspect of personhood. And so some persons then are more useful than other persons. Some persons count more in the ethical calculus than other persons, right? When we looked at Kant, he's kind of in the Aristotelian tradition, a different aspect of it, also in the Cartesian tradition of Western philosophy. We're thinking things. It's all about reason. Reason, reason, reason. Even love is a reasoning thing that we think about, we decide about. It's not just this feeling that we have. That's too changing. Right? It's too fickle. But then when we look at something like care ethics, that's the important part of who we are. That's how we should base our ethics, is upon things like love and compassion and sympathy and empathy, our connections. They would emphasize social animal in a different aspect than Mill does. Right? Mill, how useful are we? Right? Care ethics, how loving are we? What's this community look like? What about relationships? That's primarily what we are. Okay? And so that then becomes the basis for their ethical theories, right? Based upon what they think persons are and should be. Right? And so we've got thinking things, social animals, this concept of love and relationship. I wonder and so this is kind of one of my areas that I dig anyway, so I'll probably dig a little deeper maybe than even I should, but oh well. You can't stop me because you're not here to tell me stop. So, Holmes Ralston III, who's an environmental philosopher, wants to say that the thing that separates us from everything else is the fact that we value things, that we have preferences. And that's sort of tied to the love thing, I think, right? That we love certain things, we value certain things over and above other things. So, for example, if you value jewelry, then when someone has a new piece of jewelry, you're your attention will be drawn to it in a way that those of us who don't care about jewelry won't be. Or if you care about sports, or you care about cars, or whatever it is that you care about it. Other people care about it, but not everyone else cares about it. Max Scheler calls this the ordo amoris, the order of the heart, right? That your heart is attuned to certain things because of your experiences and so on and so forth. So this aspect of love. So Holmes Rawson III talks about value. We value things in a way that deer don't value things. Okay. And then Heidegger so Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher of the early 1900s, wants to say that the human condition is multifaceted and you can't really define it, but there are certain guidelines and similarities, things that we all share in common. One of those is being in the world, right? That we're all necessarily in a world. And Heidegger wants to go on to draw the distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity. So an authentic way of being in the world is realizing that you're in the world, but not necessarily of the world. Heidegger was not a Christian later in his life. He was early on in his life. Before turning towards philosophy, he was taken to be a Jesuit priest. Excuse me while I try to adjust the lighting here in my basement. By lighting, I mean the light. So my hands aren't doing something weird. I could do shadow puppets. Okay. Right, so we're beings in the world necessarily, right? That even if you're living authentically and even if you're living for God or whatever, you're still in the world. You're still here, right? We're all still dealing with COVID-19 and all of that stuff. We're still here, right? Even enlightenment doesn't mean you magically vanish and go to some other plane of existence, right? You're still here in the world, right? But there's an inauthentic way of being in the world where you just do what the world does unreflectively. So there's an aspect of the thinking thing here as well. He's still a Western philosopher in the German tradition specifically. So there's this aspect of reflection upon being in the world, making decisions reflectively instead of just doing it because everyone else does it. That would be the inauthentic being of the world rather than in the world. Furthermore, he says that we're beings with others. Again, that can be either authentically caring about others, concern, sorga, he says, or inauthentically, oh yeah, these other people are here too, that I guess are kind of getting in my way, that I need to take advantage of, whatever inauthentic way of being with others you want to imagine. So that's building upon the social animal aspect, the community aspect. But what separates Heidegger is that he also wants to emphasize death. He wants to talk about we're beings unto death. The fact that we die and that we are aware of our own mortality changes everything. And so if you read, I guess they call themselves futurists, sometimes they'll call themselves post-humanists or transhumanists, that we will no longer be human once we transcend death, whatever that looks like, right? Whether that's downloading our consciousnesses into these things, or if it's, our physical bodies live on forever, or, we augment and amplify and get mechanical everything that don't break down, whatever that looks like. Once death is defeated, we'll no longer be human, we'll be something else. And they're really building off of Heidegger, right? Squirrels die. They may not know that they die. So their existence then is different. The fact that we know that we will die, Heidegger says, becomes the impetus for everything else, right? It's the reason that we do anything. If we had all of eternity, we wouldn't do anything. I don't like mowing the grass, okay? It's not even that big of a job. The yard isn't that huge. I just don't like doing it. So I put it off as long as possible. Some of you, not all of you of course, some of you, most of you probably because you are college students, put off doing the exams that I assign to the last possible moment, right? The night before, the day before. Some of you, again, maybe you're better than that, so you get started the night of, right? Week ahead of time, great. Some of you, I can tell, wait until the last possible moment, and you wouldn't even get around to it then if it wasn't due the next day. Due dates, endpoints, are the reason that we then do things. If I lived for eternity, I don't know that I'd ever get around to mowing the grass. But I don't, right? The grass will continue to grow. I can't let it overtake the house. So at some point I have to go out and mow the thing, even though I don't want to. There's a due date, right? So Heidegger says that's the way death is. If we live forever, we won't really do anything. The fact that we die is the reason we do anything. We undertake projects, right? And there's this future orientation of projecthood. We can think about the future. We can think about where we want to be and the things that we want to do and the things that we want to accomplish in a way, again, that it seems squirrels don't. And even if squirrels do, it just means they're stuck in the same situation we are. It doesn't change anything for us. It just makes the squirrel's lives a whole lot more complicated. Right? And again, much of this is still based upon reflection and the awareness of. And so we undergo these projects. He also talks about the fact that this in the world thing is something we didn't choose. We're just kind of thrown into it. Right? And so imagine a ball that's thrown, and imagine the ball has consciousness. It doesn't necessarily know where it came from. It really doesn't even know where it's going to land. It just knows, man, I'm flying now. What's up with that? So there's this disorientation, this alienation. And so what Heidegger wants to talk about is this connection with others then, because we're all these balls in the air that don't know where we came from or where we're going. So we should help each other out instead of trying to trample on each other. Okay. So then from Heidegger, then we get Jean-Paul Sartre, also of the early 20th century. And he's a little more dire. Okay? He says, look, freedom seems like a great thing until you have it. Right? We're completely free. We're free will, free thinking, all that stuff. And that sounds great, except that it's overwhelming and crippling. That too many choices is just as crippling as no choice whatsoever. Right? That if you go to the cereal aisle of the grocery store, and this is not his example, this is my example for what he's talking about. Okay? Sartre doesn't go to the grocery store and buy cereal. He's French. That was a joke. If you go to the grocery store, right, there's an entire aisle full of cereals. It's overwhelming. I don't know which one to try. There are too many of them to try. This is Schrappe's personal experience, not with the cereal aisle, but with news sources out there on the internet and so forth. I'm sure there are great ones out there. There's also some that are garbage. I don't know which ones are which, so I don't try any of them. I haven't dipped my toe into the podcast thing. There's just too many. It's too overwhelming. I don't want to choose poorly, so I choose not to choose at all. What this does then, if Sartre is right, is it causes this complete freedom, this absolute freedom, causes things like anxiety, anguish, despair. Think about Spider-Man. Spider-Man is never sure that he did the right thing. Ever. He is the perfect superhero for the 1960s, and he's a teenager. It's fantastic. Because Sartre is writing in the 50s and 60s, and then that kind of has an influence here in the United States right around that time. Stan Lee knows what he's doing. And so Spider-Man's this unsure teenager trying to figure things out, and so he's constantly anxious. He's constantly nervous. He's awkward all the time. Sartre says, welcome to life, people. That life itself is awkward. It's not that we have anguish and anxiety. If it's something you had, you can get rid of it. He says this is something that we are, so we can't get rid of it. We are necessarily full of anxiety, which then leads to despair because we don't know which choice is the right one, and even in hindsight don't know which one is the right one. So that's Sartre's take on personhood. Anxiety, despair, anguish, because of freedom. He says we're condemned to be free. It'd be nice if we had a rule book, right? Hey, here's the thing that you should do. It's, again, go back to Nietzsche. It's one of the reasons that so many of us like job descriptions. Hey, here's the thing you're supposed to do. Sweet, now I know what I'm supposed to do. Right? That the freedom that comes with no job description, for some is very freeing. For others, it's very crippling. Like, oh man, I don't know what to do. What am I supposed to do? It's the reason why some people, again, not everyone, but some people, my brother-in-law is one of these. My brother-in-law, who's my wife's brother, not my brother-in-law, who's my wife's sister's husband. He joined for different reasons. But my wife's brother joined the military because he was sort of floundering through life. He didn't have direction. He didn't really have purpose. So he joined the military so that he knew what it was he was supposed to do. What do you do? Whatever your commanding officer tells you to do. That's what you do. Then from Sartre, then we get Albert Camus, another French philosopher of the early 1900s, around 1950, 1960 or so, who says that life itself is just absurd. He talks about the myth of Sisyphus. And so Sisyphus is one of only 3 people punished in Hades. His punishment is he has to roll a huge rock up a huge hill. It takes him all day to get it to the top. and then it rolls back down, he walks back down and pushes the rock back up again tomorrow. That's absurd. It's pointless. It's meaningless. Sartre says, welcome to life. Every project that you undertake is that huge rock. But Camus says, but at that moment, when the rock is at the top, right before it starts to roll back down, he says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus doesn't say Sisyphus is happy. Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. So maybe the capacity to imagine is an aspect of personhood that separates us from other things. It allows us to then do things like create art, for instance. And he says life's absurd. And so then from Camus then comes the absurdist comedy of the 1950s and primarily 1960s and early 1970s. Folks like Steve Martin and Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and these other goofy shows that you watch. Is there political satire there? Yeah, a little bit. But it's also just goofy. It's silliness. It's absurd because so is life, right? So comedy should then reflect that absurdity and that ridiculousness of life. And so that's Camus. Richard Rorty says we're first and foremost, and he's more in the late 1900s. I believe he's still alive, or no, I think he died 3 or 4 years ago. But he's a very contemporary philosopher, writing primarily 1980s and 90s. And he says that what persons are, the human condition, the thing that separates us from everything else is we're narrative creatures. We like telling stories, right? That it's much more interesting to read a novel than it is a biology textbook for most folks, right? That we don't want lists of facts. We want stories. It's why we like movies. We like songs. They tell stories. Why we like hanging out with friends, because we tell stories about our life. It's not, here's the list of accomplishments that I had in the past week. That person's boring. You want the person who's going to embellish and tell the story. Mark Twain made an entire career out of storytelling. He would travel around the country just telling the stories. So we're narrative creatures, first and foremost, says Dick Rorty. John Dewey, we're primarily experiencers. That yeah, we do the reflection thing, but we do that after we have the experience. And part of the experience is the emotional content to it. So we're emotional as well, right? That we're complicated. Gee, imagine that, we're complicated. So we have experiences in this world. Then we think about the experiences that we had. Then heck, then we probably express it some way to somebody through art or through storytelling or something along those lines. Right? E.O. Wilson, in his book Biophilia, says that what we are is we're attracted to other life. It's why when we look at the front of a car, we imagine, again, imagination, we imagine that it's like a face, right? The headlights are like eyes and the grill is like a mouth. It still weirds me out to watch the movie Cars. It's the only one of the 3 I watched. The other 2 are, man. The first one's good, but it still weirds me out because the faces are on the windshield. That's not where I think of a face when I look at a car. I think of it as being down below. And so it's strange because in my head it's almost like they have 2 faces, right? Like the grill is still their mouth, but their eyes are up on their windshield. That's weird, right? When we look at a manhole cover, right, it's circular, or we imagine eyes and a mouth and so on and so forth. Look at an electrical outlet. We wonder why kids are attracted to it and want to touch it because it looks like a face. That's why they want to touch it. It's got 2 eyes. Where is one? I think there's one right back here. Probably can't see it, but you know what electrical outlets look like, right? There's 2 eyes and a mouth. A mouth saying, right? It's a surprised face. Oh, shocked. Shocked, get it? Because electricity. I didn't even mean to do it that time. So, didn't you miss this? Probably not. But anyway, right? So we're attracted to other life, right? And there may be an aspect of the care ethics thing too, the community relationships, we're all connected, so on and so forth, the environmental movement and things. That may be a part of it as well. Slavoj Žižek, crazy Slovenian, actually ran for president, was doing well in the polls until his opponents accused him of being too smart to be president. Then his poll numbers dropped and he didn't get elected. But Slavoj Žižek says that primarily what we are is we're just, and this may be building off of Mill somewhat, we're just a matter of roles that we play. We're just actors. So what's weirding everyone out right now about being at home and working is that their worlds are colliding, right? That their roles are being smushed together, right? When I'm home, I'm not used to talking to you guys as teacher. I'm used to talking to my kids as parent, or my wife as husband. And so this is weirding me out to be in this location doing this, right? Because if Zizek is right, there is no David, there is no Dr. Schrappe here. All I am is a series of roles that I play, right? So at school I'm teacher, at home I'm father and husband, at the store I'm consumer, right? That I just wear different hats or different masks depending on where I am. And there's no me underneath all of these things. So says Zizek. That's the human condition. That's what personhood is this constantly shifting thing. But who I really want to focus on today is Marianne Warren. And in a really famous article written in the early 1970s, and I don't want to give away the title of the article yet, because it gives away too much. She goes through and she gives a list of 5 criteria that she thinks define personhood. And she says, the absence of these things would then be adequate evidence that the thing in question is not a person, and therefore not a part of the moral community, for instance, does not have rights and corresponding responsibilities. And these 5 criteria that she gives have really overarching and overreaching ramifications for ethics, not just for animals, but possibly also artificial intelligence, possibly aliens if they're out there and we ever encounter them, and us as well, right? And who counts and who doesn't. So, the 5 that she gives, and she says, look, I don't know that all 5 of these are necessary. I know that probably more than one would be necessary to count as person, with their corresponding rights and responsibilities. So that's really what we're getting at here. So we're not talking about genetic humans. We're talking about persons. We're talking about, and later on in her article, Marianne Warren says, look, when it comes to extraterrestrials and so forth, if we run across any, we'll need to ask ourselves, ultimately, should we let it vote or should we eat it? Right? And so the stuff that we eat isn't person-like enough to count. It doesn't meet enough of this criteria that it's part of the moral community, that it has the right to not be eaten, for instance. But it also does not have the responsibility then to be a part of the moral community. If we give something a right to vote, we're also saying you have the right to vote and the responsibility to be a part of this community. That the rights and the responsibilities come together. So she says the first one is consciousness. And the parentheticals are important in her definitions. Right? She's trying to be precise, but not too precise. So for consciousness specifically, she says, in particular, the capacity to feel pain. This could also tie back to Mill in some ways, right? So Mill, not only is it about our function and our utility, remember utilitarianism starts with aversion to pain, first and foremost. So we are pain averse. Then secondarily, since we don't like pain, oh yeah, I guess happiness is a nice second thing, right? And so that's why we maximize happiness, greatest happiness principle, and all of that. So consciousness, the capacity to feel pain. Marianne is not clear what type of pain she's talking about. Is she talking about the capacity to experience physical pain, to like understand that you're in pain? Or is she talking about something deeper, like some type of mental pain, or emotional pain, psychological pain, spiritual pain? Capacity to feel pain is all she says. Okay. Secondly, then, reasoning. Again, this is the Western philosophical tradition. Reasoning, the developed capacity to solve new and relatively complex problems. Okay. Third, self-motivated activity. By that she means activity which is relatively independent of either genetic or direct external control. Fourth, the capacity to communicate by whatever means messages of an indefinite variety of types, that is, not just with an indefinite number of possible contents, but on indefinitely many possible topics. Fifth, the presence of self-concepts and self-awareness. We thought consciousness was unclear. It gets really funky after that. Reasoning, fairly clear. Self-motivated activity, fairly unclear. Even entities that we would all agree are persons. You, your classmates, me. How much of our activity is actually self-motivated? Neuroscience, all of the time, almost on a daily basis, is calling into question free will itself. That more and more of our decisions are determined and dictated by our genetics, so biology and neuroscience, by our genetics, then we realize maybe we're just really complicated stimulus response creatures and don't actually have free will at all. We've just fooled ourselves into thinking that we do. That's possible. In which case, there is no self-motivated activity for us either. This is why Mary Ann, remember this in the early 1970s, she has to say activity which is relatively independent of either genetic or direct external control. And okay, let's presume free will. Let's say Sartre is right, we have freedom, and that's crippling, and so on and so forth. So we have free will. But to what extent do we submit to direct external control all the time? If it weren't for the fact that you were enrolled in college, needing particular grades to remain enrolled, in order to get the degree, in order to get the particular job that you want, how many of you would really be watching this video now, whenever it is that you're watching this thing? Are you not being controlled by something else? Would you just freely, if you could, if there weren't classes and all of that stuff, and you're just sitting around, bored, you're like, wow, Dr. Schrappe's talking about personhood, sweet, let me check this out. Says no one ever. Are you really free to decide to choose to watch this or not? Or are you somewhat coerced, somewhat controlled to watch this thing? Heck, to what extent am I controlled to do this thing? Right? It's not like I just sit around the house, boy, I'm bored. Ooh, I know, I'm going to post a video out there on personhood, because that'll be fun. I mean, it's fun to talk about, but the fun that I derive from talking about it's having, people in class to talk to about it, not just me randomly babbling for however long I'm going to babble for about this. This is not fun for me. I miss all of you guys. But I'm sort of being externally controlled to continue with class, because I'm getting paid to do it. Again, that's not my main motivation for being a teacher, but it is my motivation for doing this specifically, because we have to continue with class. We continue with class so that you can continue to get a grade and work towards degrees and so on and so forth. We continue to do class so that I can continue to get paid, so I can continue to support my family, so on and so forth. Again, that's not my intent for being an educator. My intent for being an educator is to educate. And by the way, I get paid. Not, I get paid, and by the way, maybe I'll do some teaching. It's a completely different motivation. But are we actually self-motivated at all? Any of us, ever? And we move on to communication. I mean, this is the Turing test, right? So the Turing test, let's presume that we put one of you in a room. Well, okay, we don't even have to presume, we're all separated anyway. So let's presume that one of you, does something on the discussion board about this video thing, questions, comments, whatever. And let's presume that a computer, just a computer, no person, just the computer itself, also comments on this thing for whatever reason. If we can't tell the difference between which one's a person and which one's just the machine, then we've reached the stage of artificial intelligence. because the machine can communicate at the same level, with the same nuance and so on and so forth, that the person can. Capacity to communicate. Warren says, by whatever means, messages of an indefinite variety of types, not just with an indefinite number of possible contents, but on indefinitely many possible topics. I'm a nerd. I know lots of things about lots of things, but there are some things I don't know anything about. I don't know stuff about animals. I'm not a zoologist. I don't know any. I don't know, how big this animal is relative to that animal and so on. I don't know any of that stuff. So I can't talk about an indefinite number of topics. I can't talk about that one. I got nothing. Plants I'm not very good at, even though I work at the conservatory. I'm not great at plant identification. There's a whole lot of stuff I know nothing about. I'm not great at cars. I'm not a gearhead. Jewelry, I don't know. I don't care about jewelry. My wife had to have a discussion with me. So this is before she was my wife. This is when we were engaged. And shortly after we were married as well. We were the first of our friend group to get married. And so we would have friends, oh, they got engaged. Then we go over and visit and, whatever. And then my wife asked, ooh, can I see the engagement ring? I never asked to see the ring because I don't care about jewelry. I have one piece of jewelry, this one right here, my own wedding ring. I've even thought about replacing that with a tattoo, but that's a different issue. Apparently it's super painful to get it on your finger. And anyway, I don't care about jewelry, so I didn't ask to see the ring. So we get back in the car, and my now wife is like, why didn't you ask to see the ring? And I said, because I don't care about jewelry. And she said, you got to pretend because that's what you do. It's like, okay. Seems sort of like lying. Maybe I'm Kantian, who knows? But anyway, right? I don't know anything about jewelry. I don't know. My mom likes jewelry. Thankfully, my wife doesn't, so I saved some money there. But cars, there's a whole bunch of stuff I don't know anything about. I can't speak. Let's go back to Warren here again. I can't communicate messages of an indefinite variety of types on an indefinite number of possible contents. So maybe I'm not a person. Fifth, self-awareness. Good luck figuring that one out. Self-awareness. Good luck figuring out what self is, let alone what it means to be aware, let alone what it means to be aware of that self. That's really complicated. That's the history of philosophy right there. That's probably the history of mankind right there. Self-awareness, what's up with that? So maybe it's just the capacity to question these things. Maybe that's part of what personhood means. I don't know. But where it gets interesting then is when we start trying to apply, especially Mary Ann Warren's criteria here. The title of her article is In Defense of Abortion. So she's giving her criteria for personhood in such a way that it will include persons and exclude fetuses. The fetuses don't meet enough of the criteria such that they should be considered persons, such that they have rights to things like continued survival, for example. And notice there's not future built in here, right? The capacity to in the future is not a part of this. This means as of right now. And again, perhaps this is somewhat Mill-like, because we don't know the future. We can make best guesses about, but there are fetuses that, for whatever reason, will not be able to develop the capacity to reason, or even the capacity to feel pain, let alone the three more complicated ones that maybe even we don't meet, right? And so therefore, since a fetus is not a person, you're therefore ethically justified in having an abortion. It's not a person. You're not killing someone. You're having something removed. It's like a tumor that you're having removed. It's like a tapeworm that you have removed. This is Mary Ann Warren's position, right? But it also, I think, pertains to end-of-life stuff as well, right? The convicted killer, for instance, okay? The Ted Bundys and Charles Mansons of the world, right? Do they meet enough of the criteria that they're still persons? Because it does seem we treat persons differently than we treat non-persons. It's much easier to execute or kill a monster than it is a person. And notice how many people the words people use are interesting. That many people use words like monster to describe those types of people. Frequently, it comes down to whether they show remorse or not, at least as far as juries are concerned, when it comes to sentencing. That if the defendant seems to show remorse of any kind, they're much more reticent to sentence them to the death penalty than if they don't. So for a lot of people at least, then, part of what it means to be a human, part of what it means to be a person, is this feeling thing that these individuals are not demonstrating. Right? The British production of the latest BBC version of Sherlock. Right? He's a high-functioning sociopath, I believe it is. Is how he describes himself. Because he doesn't have this emotional connection to other people. Right? Dr. House or something along those lines. Right? But notice, that's not here in what Warren's talking about. There's no emotional thing here. Right? Look at the way that enemies during wartime are I don't know how to say that word, become caricatures. Right? If you look at the print ads or political cartoons of the 1940s, the way that the Japanese were portrayed, the way that the Germans were portrayed, they weren't portrayed as people. They were portrayed as something else. Why? Because it's a whole lot easier to take the life of a non-person than it is to take the life of a person. Right? What about, brain-dead Uncle Jimmy? Probably not self-aware anymore. Can't really communicate. Doesn't have any self-motivated activity. Has probably lost the capacity to reason because he's brain dead. Maybe he can't even experience pain, and even if he could, from Warren's perspective, that wouldn't be enough. You don't keep Uncle Jimmy alive. You also don't continue to call him Uncle Jimmy. Most folks then consider him to be vegetable rather than person. He may still have relationships. He's not aware of the relationships. So maybe awareness is kind of lurking under and behind all of this. If you think about artificial intelligence, a very interesting movie, Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix. Most people want to focus on, did he love an operating system? Who cares? The interesting question is, did the operating system love him? Is the operating system capable of something like love? If it is, then that seems very person-like. Maybe we can't just turn it off at night. Right? Perhaps that disrespects its rights or something along those lines. That when it comes to the extraterrestrials, if and when we ever run across them, we'll have to determine, probably based on some type of communication, whether they're self-aware, have self-motivated activity, have reason, are able to experience pain. Because if they can do those things, then they're more like us. If they can't, they're more like cabbage. So it's probably okay to eat them. And if you think about the animals that most people eat, and think about the criteria that they do or don't meet, cows. Capacity to feel pain? Maybe. Capacity to reason? Probably not. Not person-like enough. Eat it then. Dogs, capacity to feel pain? Yep. Capacity to reason? Maybe. Maybe, if by reasoning we include things like the capacity to understand purpose. I think I mentioned before in these classes that some research indicates that dogs can now experience depression the same way that humans do. And the ones that experience the highest level of depression are the ones that used to be service dogs or canine dogs and now are retired. They've lost purpose. Self-motivated activity, communicate, self-awareness. People talk all the time about cats doing their own thing. That seems like self-motivated activity. Guess what we don't eat? Cats. And so I wonder just how far-reaching this idea of personhood really is with regards not just to persons, but also other things as well. And so that's why it lays the groundwork for biomedical ethics. And we'll talk about things like genetic engineering and what does that have to do with personhood. And what about the role of playing God, whatever that means. But next time, then, for next time, then I want the questions will be more about animal rights, and is it okay to test on them, and what about bullfighting, and what things should we be eating and not eating, and so on and so forth, and environmental impact, and all of that stuff, and how much of that will tie back to your definition of what it means to be a person or not. There's an interesting movie, not a great movie, but an interesting movie called Bicentennial Man. And throughout the course of the movie, then, this robot goes through certain changes. And really what the audience is being forced to do is to ask themselves, wait, person now? Person now? Person now? And the whole reason he's doing this is because he wants the rights that come with personhood, because he wants to marry a person. So I don't want to ruin the movie for you or anything along those lines. It's an interesting movie to watch because, again, it's about the viewer figuring out what are the essential aspects of personhood for them. What do they consider to be a person and why? All right, so stay safe. I'll communicate with you later. Bye.